Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm 28 years old, and I flew 8 hours from London just to watch my sister Claire marry into the most prestigious family in Tuscany. But when I arrived at the Rosewood estate, they seated me in the servants' quarters while strangers dined at the family table. My mother whispered, "That failure will ruin our reputation." And when I stood up to ask why Grandmama Elena was locked away in the cottage like a shameful secret, she slapped me in front of 200 guests. 20 minutes later, a helicopter landed in the vineyard, and what happened next changed everything. Wanna guess who really owned those rolling hills? If you've ever been betrayed by those you loved most, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you're ready to hear how I finally stood up for myself after years of manipulation. I stepped out of the rental car on a scorching July afternoon in Montalcino, Tuscany. The sun blazed overhead, casting sharp shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of the Rosewood estate. My simple black dress, purchased from a vintage shop in Camden Market, felt suddenly inadequate among the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits flowing through the wrought iron gates. The scent of lavender and roasted tomatoes drifted from the estate's kitchen, mixing with the sharp notes of expensive champagne being poured on silver trays. Everywhere I looked, guests glided in clusters, their laughter light and practiced, their jewelry catching the Mediterranean light like scattered diamonds. I caught my reflection in the polished surface of a vintage Maserati. Wind-tousled auburn hair, no makeup beyond a touch of lip balm, freckles scattered across my nose like constellation marks. I looked like someone who'd wandered in from a hiking trail, not a wedding guest. My mother, Victoria Ashworth, spotted me from across the terrace and approached with the slow, deliberate steps of someone reviewing a disappointing investment. She wore cream silk that probably cost more than my monthly rent in London, her platinum hair swept into a chignon that could survive a hurricane. "Sophia," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Her eyes swept from my scuffed ballet flats to my second-hand clutch. "You look present." That was it. No embrace. No acknowledgement that I'd traveled across a continent to be here. Not even a nod to the fact that I'd taken unpaid leave from my job at the art restoration studio, a job she considered playing with old paintings rather than a career. Before I could respond, she'd already turned away to air-kiss someone with a larger handbag and a more impressive watch. Claire didn't notice me either, or pretended not to. She stood near the marble fountain in the center of the courtyard, radiant in ivory silk that flowed like liquid moonlight. Her fiancé, Alessandro Benedetti, heir to the Benedetti wine empire, held her hand like she was made of spun glass. When our eyes met briefly across the crowd, she offered the same polite smile she'd give a distant acquaintance, warm enough to appear gracious, distant enough to maintain boundaries. We hadn't spoken in 3 years. Not since the incident with Father's will reading, when she'd sided with Mother's decision to sell our childhood cottage in Cornwall without consulting me. "Sophia's too sentimental," she'd said then. "She lives in the past." I wandered toward the registration table, weaving between guests who spoke in rapid Italian, French, and what sounded like Portuguese. A woman with diamond earrings the size of grapes glanced at my dress, then immediately looked away. A man in a perfectly pressed linen suit stepped around me like I might be contagious. The registration hostess, a young Italian woman with a practiced smile, checked her list twice before finding my name. "Sophia Ashworth," she murmured, then handed me a small cream envelope. "Table 14. I opened it carefully. Table 14 was described as garden view intimate seating. My heart sank as I followed the map on the back of the card. Past the main terrace, around the herb garden, beyond the olive grove, and there it was, a small table tucked behind the service entrance, next to where the catering staff stored empty wine crates and used linens. 2 other people sat there already, an elderly Italian man who appeared to be someone's driver, still wearing his cap, and a woman in a plain black dress who kept checking her phone nervously, probably a personal assistant to one of the guests. I sat down slowly, smoothing my skirt. From here I could barely see the main ceremony area. The view was mostly of the kitchen's back door and a row of industrial garbage bins disguised with ivy. "Scusi, the elderly driver said gently, noticing my confusion. You are family now? I see your face in the photographs inside. I nodded. The bride's sister. He shook his head sadly. La famiglia, he murmured, then said something in Italian that sounded like a prayer or a curse. That's when I remembered Grandmama Elena. I hadn't seen her since we'd arrived. During the cocktail hour, I'd asked Mother where she was, expecting to find her holding court among the elder relatives, sharing stories about the old days when she and Grandfather ran their own vineyard in Chianti. She's resting, Mother had said dismissively, not meeting my eyes. The excitement is too much for her at her age. But Grandmama Elena was only 74, sharp as the Tuscan wind, and had traveled further than anyone to be here. She'd flown from her retirement home in Florence, excited to see Claire marry into wine country royalty. It wasn't like her to miss the ceremony. I excused myself from table 14 and walked back toward the main house. The estate was a labyrinth of terraces, courtyards, and ancient stone buildings that had been converted into luxury accommodations. I asked a passing waiter in broken Italian about Signora Elena, and he pointed toward a narrow path that led to a small cottage set apart from the main buildings. The cottage was charming, covered in climbing roses with a view of the valley, but it was also isolated, hidden behind a wall of cypress trees. I knocked softly on the wooden door. Chi è? Came a familiar voice from inside. It's Sophia, Grandmama. The door opened immediately, and there she was, tiny but fierce, her silver hair pinned with the same pearl combs she'd worn to every family gathering since I could remember. But her eyes were red-rimmed, and her usually perfect posture seemed deflated. Mia cara, she whispered, pulling me into her arms. She smelled like lavender soap and the peppermint lozenges she always kept in her purse. I hoped you would come find me. Why aren't you at the ceremony? I asked, stepping into the cottage's simple living room. It starts in an hour. Her face clouded. They said I would be more comfortable here. Away from the crowds. She gestured toward a tray on the side table, a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and water. They brought me food like I am an invalid who cannot walk to the dining room. My chest tightened. That's ridiculous. Your family. You should be in the front row. Grandmama Elena sat down heavily in a worn armchair. Your mother, she is ashamed of me, I think. She told Alessandro's family that I am recovering from a small illness and might not attend. You're perfectly healthy, I said, sitting on the ottoman beside her chair. But I am not rich anymore. I am not elegant like Victoria wishes. I speak too loudly, I laugh too much, I tell stories about when we had dirt under our fingernails and wine stains on our aprons. She looked out the window toward the main estate. I embarrass her new image. I felt something cold and hard settle in my stomach. Did she actually tell you not to come to the ceremony? Grandmama Elena's silence was answer enough. I stood up, anger rising in my throat like bile. Get dressed, I said firmly. We're going to that wedding. No, cara mia. It will only cause trouble. Good, I said, helping her to her feet. Maybe it's time for some trouble. I helped her choose a beautiful navy dress from her suitcase, the one she'd brought specifically for the ceremony, and repinned her hair with the pearl combs. She looked radiant, dignified, every inch the family matriarch she'd always been. We walked together toward the main estate, my arm linked through hers. Her steps were sure and steady, her chin lifted with quiet pride. Several guests turned to look as we approached, recognizing her from family photos they'd probably seen in Alessandro's home. The ceremony was about to begin. Guests had taken their seats in neat rows facing an archway covered in white roses and grapevines. The front rows were reserved for family. Mother and father sat in the first row on the left, Alessandro's parents across from them, various aunts, uncles, and cousins filling the prime seats. I guided Grandmama Elena toward the second row, where there were 2 empty seats that should have been ours all along. As we settled in, I felt eyes turning our way. Mother's head snapped around, her face immediately tightening with displeasure. She rose from her seat and approached us with quick, sharp steps, her smile fixed and threatening. Mother, she hissed under her breath, leaning close. You're supposed to be resting. I am rested, Grandmama Elena replied calmly. And I am ready to watch my granddaughter marry. You'll catch cold in this heat, Mother said through gritted teeth. You should go back to the cottage. I am perfectly comfortable, Grandmama Elena said, her voice carrying enough volume that nearby guests began to notice. Mother's eyes flicked nervously around the crowd, then settled on me with laser intensity. Sophia, take her back. No. No, I said quietly but clearly. She belongs here. The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. Mother's face flushed red beneath her careful makeup. She leaned closer, her whisper sharp as broken glass. Don't embarrass us more than you already have. Look around you, this isn't your world. You're here out of charity. And she's here because she's family, I replied, not lowering my voice. Mother straightened, her composure cracking slightly. She's confused. The medication makes her disoriented. There's no medication, I said, louder now. Several heads turned our way. And she's not confused. You just don't want her here because she reminds everyone where this family actually came from. The silence that followed was deafening. Mother's hand rose before I even registered the movement. The slap cracked across my cheek like thunder, sharp and echoing in the hushed courtyard. Gasps rippled through the assembled guests. Someone's champagne glass hit the ground and shattered. The string quartet faltered mid-note. How dare you, Mother whispered, her voice shaking with rage. You ungrateful, selfish girl. You come here in your thrift store dress, you disturb a peaceful family gathering, and you dare to question my decisions. I touched my cheek, feeling the sting spread like fire across my skin. But I didn't step back. I didn't apologize. Instead, I looked around at the shocked faces staring at us, these wealthy strangers who'd just witnessed a family imploding in real time. My grandmother built this family, I said, my voice carrying across the silent courtyard. She worked these vineyards with her bare hands. She taught 3 generations how to make wine. And you locked her away like she's something to be ashamed of. Security, Mother called sharply, gesturing to a man in a dark suit near the entrance. Please escort my daughter from the premises. She's had too much sun. But before anyone could move, a sound cut through the tension, the deep, rhythmic thrum of helicopter blades approaching from the north. Everyone looked up as a sleek black helicopter crested the hills, flying low over the vineyard rows before settling in the field beyond the olive grove. The downdraft sent rose petals swirling through the air like confetti. I stayed frozen, one hand still pressed to my burning cheek, watching as the helicopter's door opened and 2 figures emerged. The first was a tall man in an expensive suit, moving with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. The second was a woman, small and elegant, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about the way she moved, the tilt of her head, the confident set of her shoulders. The man spoke briefly into a phone, then began walking toward the estate with purposeful strides. The woman followed, and as they drew closer, I felt Grandmama Elena's hand tighten on my arm. Madonna mia, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling dust. Is that? The woman approaching us was older than my grandmother, maybe 85, but she moved like someone half her age. Her clothes were simple but impeccably tailored, a cream-colored dress, low heels, a single strand of pearls. Her face was lined but sharp, her eyes a startling blue that seemed to take in everything at once. When she reached the edge of the ceremony area, she paused, surveying the scene with the calm assessment of someone who'd walked into countless difficult situations and emerged victorious. Then she smiled, not the polite, social smile I'd been seeing all day, but something warmer and more knowing. Good afternoon, she said in lightly accented English, her voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Mother had gone completely pale. Father, who'd been sitting frozen in his front row seat, slowly stood up, his face a mask of confusion and growing dread. Mrs. Benedetti, Alessandro's father said uncertainly, rising from his own seat. We weren't expecting, that is, we thought you were unable to travel. The woman, Mrs. Benedetti, Alessandro's grandmother, chuckled softly. Oh, I never miss a family wedding. Especially not when it involves my vineyard. The weight of those words settled over the gathering like a blanket of snow. Alessandro, who'd been standing at the altar waiting for his bride, took a step forward, his face uncertain. Nana, he said carefully. What do you mean, your vineyard? Mrs. Benedetti's blue eyes swept across the assembled guests, landing briefly on my mother's stricken face, then moving to where Grandmama Elena and I stood together. I mean, she said clearly, that this estate, these vineyards, this house, every grapevine you can see from here to the hills, belongs to me. Not to your father, not to the Benedetti Corporation, but to me personally. And I've been very curious to meet the family my grandson is marrying into. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Mrs. Benedetti continued walking, her pace unhurried but determined, until she stood directly in front of our small group. Up close, I could see that her eyes held not malice, but a kind of patient intelligence, like someone who'd spent decades watching and learning before acting. You must be Victoria, she said to my mother, her tone perfectly pleasant. Alessandro has told me so much about you. How you've worked so hard to present your family in the best possible light. Mother opened and closed her mouth several times before managing. Mrs. Benedetti, what an honor. We had no idea you were planning to attend. Oh, I wasn't, Mrs. Benedetti replied easily. But then I received a very interesting phone call this morning. From my friend Elena Rossi. She turned to my grandmother, her smile warming several degrees. Cara Elena, you look exactly as beautiful as always. Grandmama Elena stood up slowly, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. Maria? Is it really you? It's really me, Mrs. Benedetti, Maria confirmed, opening her arms. They embraced like old friends, which I was beginning to realize they were. The kind of friends who'd lost touch but never lost the connection that mattered. Wait, Claire's voice cut through the emotional reunion. She'd appeared from wherever brides wait before ceremonies, still in her flowing wedding dress but looking increasingly panicked. Nana Maria, what's happening? Who is she? Maria Benedetti kept one arm around Grandmama Elena's shoulders as she turned to address the crowd, but her words were clearly meant for Claire. She, Maria said, is Elena Rossi, who owned the vineyard adjacent to ours when we were young women. We worked side by side for 30 years, sharing equipment, sharing harvest crews, sharing the good times and the difficult ones. Our families were like sisters. She paused, her gaze moving deliberately to my mother. Until Elena's family decided they were too sophisticated for dirt under their fingernails and sold their land to move to England. Elena wanted to keep the vineyard, but her son Richard convinced her that winemaking was a dying profession, that she should invest in modern opportunities instead. Father's face had gone from pale to gray. He sat down heavily, like his legs had forgotten how to support him. Richard Ashworth, Maria continued, her voice still pleasant but carrying an edge now, convinced his mother to sell me her vineyard for a fraction of its value, claiming she needed the money immediately for medical expenses that never materialized. He took the payment and invested it in a London property development scheme that collapsed within 6 months. Gasps rippled through the crowd again. Alessandro stared at his grandmother in shock, then at Claire, then at my parents. The property development scheme, Maria said, was run by Richard's business partner, who happened to be Richard himself, under a different company name. Elena lost everything, her land, her savings, her life's work. Richard made a fortune. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. This was family history I'd never heard, secrets that had been buried so deep I'd never even suspected they existed. That's not true, Mother said suddenly, her voice shrill. Richard worked honestly. He built our success through legitimate business. Maria Benedetti's eyebrows rose slightly. Did he? Then perhaps you can explain why Elena has been living in a small apartment in Florence, surviving on a modest pension, while you've been presenting yourselves as landed gentry with deep roots in Italian wine culture." The silence stretched like a taut wire. Claire looked back and forth between her grandmother and her fiancé's grandmother, her wedding dress suddenly seeming less like celebration and more like costume. "Furthermore," Maria continued, reaching into her small purse and pulling out a folded document, "I've been trying to return Elena's vineyard to her for 20 years. But every time I attempted to contact her, I was told by various intermediaries that she had no interest in returning to Italy, that she preferred her life in England." She unfolded the document, clearly legal papers of some kind. "Imagine my surprise when Elena called me this morning from a cottage on my own estate to tell me she'd been hidden away from her granddaughter's wedding like a shameful secret." Grandmama Elena's voice, when she finally spoke, was soft but clear. "I never knew, Maria. I never knew you tried to find me. They told me you blamed me for the sale, that you never wanted to see me again. And they told me you'd moved on, that you'd forbidden your family from mentioning the vineyard because the memories were too painful." Maria's voice was gentle now, but her eyes remained hard as she looked at my parents. "It seems we've both been lied to for quite some time." The man who'd arrived with Maria stepped forward then, the one in the expensive suit who'd been standing quietly at the edge of the group. He opened a briefcase and pulled out several folders. "Mrs. Benedetti asked me to prepare some documents," he said in crisp, professional English. "I'm her attorney, James Morrison. These papers restore the original vineyard property to Elena Rossi, along with compensation for 20 years of lost income from the land." He handed the folders to Grandmama Elena, who stared at them like they might disappear if she blinked. "The property is worth approximately 4 million euros today," he continued matter-of-factly. "The income compensation brings the total to roughly 7 million. Someone in the crowd made a choking sound. Several other people began whispering frantically. Alessandro's father had gone white as his shirt. "But there's more," Maria said, her smile turning slightly predatory as she looked at my mother. "Elena isn't the only one who's been wronged here." She turned to me then, and I felt pinned under the intensity of her gaze. "Sophia, isn't it? Elena has told me quite a lot about you in our conversation this morning. How you've been treated as the family failure, the disappointment, the one who chose art restoration over serious pursuits." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Elena also told me about your thesis project at university, the one about preserving Italian Renaissance vineyard frescoes. The research you did on winemaking families who commissioned artwork to celebrate their heritage." My throat tightened. That project had been my passion for 2 years, combining my love of art with family history I'd thought I'd lost. Mother had called it navel-gazing and refused to fund the final research trip to Italy. "It seems," Maria continued, "that you're the only member of your family who's ever shown genuine interest in preserving the culture and traditions that Elena's family helped build. The only one who understood that heritage means more than money." She gestured to her attorney, who handed me a separate folder. "These documents establish the Elena Rossi Foundation for Vineyard Heritage Preservation, with you as the director. The Foundation's mission is to support young scholars and artists working to preserve the cultural legacy of Italian wine country." I stared at the papers in my hands, words blurring together as tears gathered in my eyes. "I don't understand." "The foundation has an initial endowment of 2 million euros, Maria explained. "Funded by the profits from Elena's original vineyard, which I've been holding in trust for 20 years, hoping someday to return them to their rightful owner." The courtyard had gone completely silent except for the sound of my heart hammering in my chest. This was more money than I'd ever imagined having, but more than that, it was recognition, validation that my interests, my career, my passion for preserving history actually mattered. "There is one condition," Maria added, and my stomach dropped. "You must take Elena back to her original vineyard. Help her restore it. Work together to document the traditional winemaking methods before they're lost forever." I looked at Grandmama Elena, who was crying openly now. Is that what you want?" She reached out and took my hand, her fingers thin but strong. "Cara mia, it's what I've dreamed of for 20 years. But only if you want it to. I thought about my small flat in London, my part-time job at the restoration studio, the way I'd been scraping by financially while feeling like I was constantly disappointing everyone who mattered to me. Then I thought about working in Italian sunlight, documenting traditional techniques, preserving something beautiful and ancient and real. Yes, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Yes, I want it. Maria Benedetti smiled, the first completely genuine smile I'd seen from her. Bene. Then it's settled. But Claire's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Wait. Just wait. She was staring at all of us like we'd lost our minds, her wedding dress billowing around her as she gestured frantically. What about my wedding? What about Alessandro? This is supposed to be our day. Alessandro, who'd been standing frozen throughout the entire revelation, finally stepped forward. His face was a mask of conflicted emotions, shock, hurt, confusion, and something that might have been relief. Claire, he said carefully, did you know? About your grandfather and the vineyard? Of course not. She snapped. This is all ancient history. What does it matter now? It matters, Alessandro said quietly, because my nana trusted your family. She believed we were uniting two honorable winemaking families. But your family built their wealth by stealing from mine. That's not fair, Claire protested, but her voice lacked conviction. We can't be held responsible for things that happened before we were born. No, Alessandro agreed, but we can be held responsible for how we handle the truth once we learn it. He looked around the courtyard, taking in the shocked faces of the wedding guests, the legal documents scattered between us, the weight of revelations that had turned celebration into reckoning. I can't marry into a family that would lock away their own grandmother like a shameful secret, he said finally. I can't build a life with someone who thinks heritage and honor are ancient history. Claire's face crumpled. Alessandro, please. We can work this out. My parents made mistakes, but that doesn't have anything to do with us. Doesn't it? He asked sadly. You've known Sophia your whole life and you never once stood up for her. You watched your mother treat her like she was worthless and you said nothing. If you can't defend your own sister, how can I trust you to defend our marriage? The truth of his words hit like a physical blow. I saw Claire's face change as she realized he was right, that her silence and complicity had consequences she'd never considered. The wedding is over, Alessandro announced to the crowd. Please enjoy the wine and food. But there will be no ceremony today. With that, he walked away, disappearing into the main house. Several of his family members followed, along with a number of guests who looked eager to escape the emotional wreckage. Claire stood alone in her wedding dress, mascara starting to run, looking around desperately for someone to fix a situation that was beyond repair. Mother finally found her voice again. This is ridiculous, she said shrilly. Maria, surely you don't believe these old stories. Elena's memory isn't what it used to be. My memory is perfect, Grandmama Elena said firmly, standing straighter. And so is my conscience. I never wanted to sell that vineyard. You convinced me I had no choice. You didn't have a choice. Father exploded, speaking for the first time since the helicopter had landed. The vineyard was failing. You were hemorrhaging money. I saved you from bankruptcy. By stealing from your own mother, I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. And then lying about it for 20 years. Father turned on me, his face red with rage. You have no idea what you're talking about. You weren't there. You didn't see the books, the debts, the impossible situation we were in. Then show us the books, Maria Benedetti said calmly. If the sale was legitimate, if Elena truly needed the money for medical expenses, if the vineyard was really failing, there should be documentation. Father's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Or better yet, Maria continued, explain why Elena has been living in poverty while you've been dining with Italian nobility. Explain why you never told your daughters about their heritage. Explain why you allowed Elena to believe I blamed her for something you orchestrated. The weight of accumulated lies seemed to be crushing him. He sat down heavily in one of the ceremony chairs, his head in his hands. It was supposed to be temporary, he mumbled. I was going to pay her back. The development deal was supposed to work. I never meant for it to go this far. But it did go this far, I said quietly. And you let it. Mother stepped forward, her composure finally cracking completely. Don't you dare judge us, she hissed at me. We gave you everything. Education, opportunities, a chance at a better life than we had. You gave me shame, I replied, my voice steady despite the tears on my cheeks. You taught me that I was never good enough, never worthy, never the daughter you wanted. You made me believe I was a disappointment when the real disappointment was you. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Claire sobbing quietly into her hands. Maria Benedetti stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. Come, she said kindly. Let's leave them to sort out their own conscience. You and Elena have more important things to do. I looked around the courtyard one last time, at my parents sitting in their expensive clothes looking lost and exposed, at Claire in her ruined wedding dress, at the scattered guests who'd come expecting a celebration and found a reckoning instead. What about my things? I asked. My luggage is at the hotel. We'll collect it later, Maria said. Right now, I want to show you something much more important. She led us away from the ceremony area, away from the main house, toward a path I hadn't noticed before. Grandmama Elena walked between us, her steps lighter than they'd been all day, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The path wound through olive groves and lavender fields, climbing gently toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. As we walked, Maria talked about the land, pointing out different grape varieties, explaining the soil composition, sharing stories about harvests and celebrations that stretched back generations. Your grandmother, she said to me, had the best instincts for wine I've ever seen. She could taste a grape and tell you exactly when to harvest, how much rain we'd had, whether the wine would be good for drinking young or aging for decades. She taught me to taste properly, I said, remembering summer afternoons in our cottage garden, when Grandmama Elena would let me sip tiny amounts of wine and explain what I was tasting. Before we moved to London. And you remembered, Maria said approvingly. Elena told me you still have wine journals from when you were 12 years old. I blushed. I thought it was silly childhood stuff. It's not silly. It's heritage. It's continuity. It's the difference between making wine and making money. We reached the top of the ridge as the sun began to set, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. Below us, row upon row of grapevines stretched toward the horizon, heavy with fruit that would soon be ready for harvest. There, Maria said, pointing to a section of vineyard that looked slightly different from the rest, older vines, more irregular rows, a farmhouse tucked among the trees. That's Elena's original vineyard. It's been waiting for her to come home. Grandmama Elena stood beside me, her hand finding mine as we looked down at the land she'd lost and found again. It's smaller than I remembered, she said softly. But it's yours, I said, squeezing her fingers. It's really yours. Ours, she corrected, smiling through her tears. If you want it to be. I thought about London, about my small life there, about the way I'd been marking time rather than really living. Then I thought about this place, this legacy, this chance to build something meaningful with the grandmother who'd always believed in me. I want it, I said. I want all of it. As we stood there watching the sunset paint the vineyard in impossible colors, I felt something settle in my chest, not happiness exactly, but something deeper. Purpose, maybe. Or just the simple relief of finally knowing where I belonged. Behind us, the sound of the wedding reception continued faintly, music and laughter and conversation that felt like it belonged to a different world. Our world was here on this hill, looking down at vines that had survived everything and were ready to flourish again. There's one more thing, Maria said as we began walking back down the path. The foundation I mentioned, I hope you'll consider making your first project a comprehensive study of this vineyard. Document Elena's traditional methods, preserve the techniques that have been passed down through generations. Before they're lost forever, I agreed, understanding flooding through me. This wasn't just about reclaiming property, it was about preserving knowledge, honoring the past while building toward the future. Exactly. And Elena, Maria turned to my grandmother, I hope you'll consider moving back to Italy. The farmhouse is fully restored, and the cottage on my estate is yours for as long as you want it. Grandmama Elena nodded slowly. I think I've been in exile long enough. We walked back through the olive groves as stars began to appear overhead. The reception was still going on, though considerably diminished. Many guests had left after the ceremony was cancelled, and those who remained seemed more interested in gossip than celebration. Mother and father were nowhere to be seen. Claire sat alone at what should have been the head table, still in her wedding dress but with her shoes kicked off and her hair falling out of its elaborate arrangement. She looked up as we approached, her eyes red and swollen. Sophia, she said quietly. I'm sorry. I stopped walking, studying her face for signs of the sister I'd once known. Sorry for what? For all of it. For not standing up for you. For letting them treat Grandmama Elena like she was embarrassing. For caring more about impressing Alessandro's family than protecting my own. Her voice cracked on the last words, and I felt some of the anger I'd been carrying begin to soften. I know, I said simply. But sorry doesn't undo 28 years of being invisible in my own family. No, she agreed. It doesn't. But maybe it's a start. I looked at her sitting there in her ruined wedding dress, and for a moment I saw the little girl who used to build blanket forts with me, who taught me to braid friendship bracelets, who cried when I left for university because she didn't want me to go. Maybe, I said. But things are going to be different now. I know, she whispered. Everything's different now. Maria's attorney appeared at my elbow with another set of documents. If you're ready, Ms. Ashworth, we can finalize the foundation paperwork tonight. The funds will be available within 48 hours. I looked at the papers, then at Grandmama Elena, then at the vineyard spread out below us in the moonlight. I'm ready, I said. As I signed my name to documents that would change everything, I felt a sense of completion I'd never experienced before. Not the completion of an ending, but of a beginning, the start of a story I'd been waiting my whole life to tell. 3 months later, I stood in the morning light of the vineyard kitchen, my hands stained purple from sorting grapes, my hair tied back with a bandana that had belonged to my great-grandmother. The farmhouse around me buzzed with quiet activity, Grandmama Elena directing the harvest crew in rapid Italian, Maria consulting her ancient weather records, and me documenting everything in detailed notes that would become the Foundation's first published research. The transformation hadn't been easy. Moving from London meant leaving behind a life I'd built, however small and unsatisfying it had been. Selling my flat, shipping my belongings, learning to navigate Italian bureaucracy, and adjusting to the rhythm of agricultural life had all presented challenges I'd never anticipated. But for the first time in my adult life, I woke up excited about each day. The vineyard had welcomed us home like it remembered us. Grandmama Elena had walked the rows that first week with tears streaming down her face, her hands stroking vine trunks like they were old friends. They're healthy, she'd murmured in wonder. Maria kept them healthy. Maria had indeed been a careful steward. The traditional growing methods Elena had pioneered, companion planting with roses and herbs, natural pest management, small batch fermentation, had been preserved and refined over the 20 years of separation. It was as if the land had been waiting for its original caretaker to return. My foundation work had begun immediately. I'd hired 2 graduate students from the University of Florence to help document Elena's techniques, and we'd started what would become a comprehensive archive of traditional Tuscan winemaking methods. Local historians, agricultural scientists, and cultural preservationists had all expressed interest in our research. More importantly, Elena had begun teaching again. Twice a week, young winemakers from across Tuscany came to learn from her, techniques that had been passed down through generations but were in danger of being lost to industrial methods. Watching her with these students, seeing her face light up as she shared her knowledge, I understood that this work was about more than wine. It was about preserving a way of life, a connection to the land that modern efficiency often abandoned. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text from Claire, saw the article about the foundation in Wine Spectator. Proud of you. Still sorry about everything. She'd been reaching out regularly since the wedding disaster, small gestures of connection that felt like tentative steps toward rebuilding trust. I'd started responding, cautiously but genuinely. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't a destination but a process. Alessandro had also been in touch, though more formally. He'd ended his engagement to Claire definitively, but he'd reached out through Maria to apologize for his family's role in perpetuating the deception about our vineyard. He'd also offered to collaborate on some of our preservation research, contributing historical documents from the Benedetti family archives. Claire was slowly rebuilding her life back in London. She'd left the fashion PR company where she'd worked and started a nonprofit focused on supporting rural communities. It wasn't winemaking, but it was work that connected her to the land in ways her previous career never had. Maybe the wedding disaster had taught her something about what really mattered. Our parents had been notably absent from all these developments. They'd returned to London immediately after the wedding weekend, and their few attempts at contact had been stilted and defensive. Father had sent a lawyer's letter claiming that the vineyard transfer wasn't legally binding due to undue influence. The letter had been quickly dismissed by Italian courts, but it had made clear that they weren't ready to acknowledge the damage they'd caused. That was their choice to make. I'd spent too many years waiting for their approval to waste more time hoping they'd suddenly develop consciences. A knock at the kitchen door interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find a young woman about my age, dressed in work clothes and carrying a worn leather portfolio. "Scusi," she said in accented English. "I am looking for Sophia Ashworth? I am Francesca Romano. I wrote to you about the frescoes." My heart jumped. Francesca was an art restoration specialist from Naples who'd contacted the foundation about vineyard frescoes throughout southern Italy that were in danger of being lost to development and neglect. She'd offered to collaborate on documenting them before they disappeared forever. "Francesca, I'm so glad you made it. Come in, please." She stepped into the kitchen, her eyes immediately drawn to the walls where we'd hung some of Elena's original vineyard sketches alongside historical photographs of the property. "This is beautiful work," she said, studying a detailed drawing of vine pruning techniques. "Your grandmother is an artist as well as a winemaker." "She says the two skills are related," I replied, pouring coffee for both of us. "Understanding form, balance, the way things grow and change over time." Francesca nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, exactly. And that's what we're losing. Not just the frescoes themselves, but the understanding of why they were painted, what they meant to the families who commissioned them." We spent the morning walking through the vineyard while Francesca explained her project. Across Italy, centuries-old vineyard frescoes were disappearing, painted over during renovations, destroyed by weather damage, forgotten as properties changed hands. Many depicted traditional winemaking techniques that were no longer practiced, serving as visual records of agricultural history. "The foundation could fund documentation efforts," I said as we paused beside a particularly old section of vines. "Photography, research into the artists and patrons, preservation of the techniques shown in the paintings." "It would be incredible," Francesca said. "There are frescoes I know of that show pruning methods from the 15th century, harvest celebrations that haven't been practiced in 200 years. If we don't document them soon, that knowledge will be lost forever." I thought about the sketches hanging in our kitchen, the careful notes Elena made about every aspect of vineyard management, the way she'd taught me to see winemaking as an art form. This was exactly the kind of work the foundation should be supporting. "Let's do it," I said. "Send me a detailed proposal. I think we can make this happen." Francesca's face lit up, and I felt that familiar surge of satisfaction that came from using resources to preserve something valuable and fragile. As we walked back toward the farmhouse, I noticed Maria's car coming up the drive. She visited several times a week, bringing news from the main estate, consulting on harvest decisions, and generally checking on our progress like a benevolent godmother. "Sophia," she called as she emerged from the car. "Perfect timing. I have news." Maria had that particular expression she wore when she was pleased about something, but trying not to show it too obviously. "What kind of news?" I asked, suddenly nervous. In my experience, unexpected news was rarely good news. "The kind that involves journalists," she said, her smile finally breaking through. "Wine and Spirits magazine wants to do a feature story about the foundation. Specifically about traditional methods being preserved and taught. They want to interview you and Elena, photograph the vineyard, document the harvest process." My stomach fluttered with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "That's wonderful. And terrifying." "It's important," Maria said firmly. "This work you're doing, it needs to be seen, shared, celebrated. Too many people think winemaking is just about technology and efficiency now. They need to understand what they're losing." Francesca, who'd been listening quietly, stepped forward. "This could be perfect timing for the fresco project too. If the magazine is interested in preservation efforts." "One project at a time," I laughed, but I was already imagining the possibilities. The foundation was only 3 months old, but already it felt like we were gathering momentum, attracting collaborators and supporters who understood the importance of our work. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. At 74, she'd thrown herself into the physical work of harvest with the enthusiasm of someone half her age. The past 3 months had transformed her. She stood straighter, laughed more easily, spoke with the authority of someone whose knowledge was valued rather than dismissed. "What are all these serious faces about?" she asked in English, though her Italian accent had grown stronger since returning home. "Wine and Spirits wants to write about us," I said, still processing the news. Elena's face broke into a grin. "About time. I have stories they won't believe." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," I muttered, but I was smiling too. As the afternoon wore on, we showed Francesca around the property, introducing her to the harvest crew and explaining our documentation process. She photographed everything, Elena's hands demonstrating pruning techniques, workers sorting grapes using methods that hadn't changed in centuries, the ancient fermentation vessels that Elena insisted produced better wine than modern steel tanks. "This is a living museum," Francesca said as we watched Elena taste grapes with the focused intensity of a master sommelier. "She carries so much knowledge in her hands, her nose, her memory. Once she's gone." "She's not going anywhere anytime soon," I said firmly, though the same thought had occurred to me. "But yes, that's exactly why we're documenting everything so thoroughly." That evening, after Francesca had left for her hotel and the harvest crew had finished for the day, Elena and I sat on the farmhouse porch with glasses of last year's vintage. The sunset painted the vineyard in shades of gold and rose, and the air carried the sweet scent of ripening grapes. "Are you happy, cara mia?" Elena asked, her voice soft in the gathering dusk. I considered the question seriously. Happy felt like too simple a word for the complex mixture of satisfaction, purpose, gratitude, and grief that had become the texture of my daily life. I was still processing the betrayal of my parents, still adjusting to the reality that the family I'd grown up in had been built on lies. But I was also experiencing a kind of deep contentment I'd never known before. "I'm home," I said finally. "For the first time in my life, I'm actually home." Elena reached over and squeezed my hand. "Your great-grandmother would be so proud. She always said the land chooses its own caretakers." I looked out over the vineyard, at the vines heavy with fruit that would soon become wine, at the farmhouse that had sheltered generations of women who'd worked this soil with their hands and hearts. The weight of responsibility felt enormous sometimes, preserving not just a business but a way of life, a connection to the earth that modern efficiency often abandoned. But it also felt right. Like I'd finally found work that mattered, a purpose that connected me to something larger than myself. My phone buzzed with another message, this one from an unknown number. "M.S. Ashworth, this is James Walsh from the BBC. We'd like to discuss a documentary about your preservation work. Please call when convenient. I showed the message to Elena, who laughed. See? The world is finally paying attention. Are you ready for all this attention? I asked. Reporters, cameras, people wanting to hear your stories? Elena's eyes sparkled in the fading light. Sophia, I've been ready to tell these stories for 20 years. The question is whether the world is ready to listen. As if summoned by our conversation, another car appeared on the drive. This one I didn't recognize, a sleek sedan with Rome license plates. My heart sank slightly, wondering what new complication was arriving at our peaceful evening. But the woman who emerged from the car was smiling, carrying a bottle of wine and a bouquet of sunflowers. She was about 50, elegantly dressed but practical, with the confident bearing of someone comfortable in her own skin. "Scusi," she called out in perfect English. "I am looking for Elena Rossi. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from the University of California at Davis. I believe we have a mutual friend named Maria Benedetti." Elena stood up immediately, her face lighting with recognition. "Sarah, is it really you?" They embraced like old friends, and I realized this was another piece of Elena's history I'd never known about. "Sophia," Elena said, turning to include me in the reunion, "this is Sarah. She studied with me 30 years ago when I was consulting for wine programs in California. Before everything changed." Dr. Chin shook my hand warmly. "I've heard so much about you and the foundation. Elena was one of my most important mentors, though I lost touch with her when she moved back to Europe. When Maria told me she'd returned to her vineyard." "You had to come see for yourself," I finished, understanding immediately. The vineyard seemed to attract people like this, those who understood that some knowledge couldn't be learned from books or laboratories, that required direct connection to the land and the people who'd worked it for generations. "I hope I'm not intruding," Dr. Chin said. "But I wanted to discuss something with both of you. The university is planning a new program in sustainable viticulture, focusing on traditional methods that produce both quality wine and environmental benefits. We'd love Elena to be a visiting professor, and we're interested in partnering with your foundation for research and student exchanges." I felt that familiar flutter of excitement mixed with overwhelm. 3 months ago, I'd been a struggling art restorer in London, invisible in my own family and uncertain about my future. Now I was fielding offers from international universities and major magazines, managing a significant foundation, and helping to preserve cultural knowledge that spanned centuries. "It's a lot to consider," I said diplomatically. "Of course," Dr. Chin agreed. "But the timing could be perfect. Elena's knowledge, your organizational skills and academic background, the foundation's resources, together you could influence how the next generation of winemakers approaches their craft." Elena, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up. "Sophia, what do you think? Another project for our growing list." I looked at my grandmother, at this woman who'd appeared unexpectedly in our evening, at the vineyard stretching out in the moonlight. Each opportunity felt like a door opening, revealing possibilities I'd never imagined. "I think," I said slowly, "we're going to need a bigger foundation." They both laughed, and the sound carried across the vineyard like a promise of all the work still to be done, all the knowledge still to be preserved, all the stories still to be told. Later that night, after Dr. Chen had left with promises to send detailed proposals and Elena had gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, making notes about everything we'd discussed. The foundation was growing faster than I'd anticipated, attracting collaborators and opportunities that could amplify our impact exponentially. It was exciting. It was also daunting. I opened my laptop and began writing an email to Claire. Despite everything that had happened between us, she remained my closest connection to the life I'd left behind. And she'd always been good at seeing the big picture, at understanding systems and structures in ways that complemented my more detail-oriented approach. "Dear Claire," I typed. "I hope you're well. Things here are developing faster than I expected, and I find myself in need of someone I trust to help think through some strategic decisions. If you're interested in a working vacation in Tuscany, I could use your input on foundation planning. No pressure, but the offer stands. Love, Sophia. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Forgiveness was a process, and maybe working together on something meaningful could help us rebuild the relationship that had been damaged by years of family dysfunction. Outside, the vineyard settled into night quiet, the vines heavy with fruit that would soon be transformed into wine. In a few weeks, the harvest would be complete, and we'd begin the careful process of fermentation and aging that would turn this year's grapes into something that could be savored and remembered. It was a good metaphor for what was happening to my own life, transformation that required patience, care, and faith that the end result would be worth the long process of becoming. I closed the laptop and walked out onto the porch one more time before bed. The night air was cool and sweet, filled with the promise of autumn and harvest and all the work still to be done. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I belonged.